September 23, 2023. South of the Zaporizhzhia region, the village of Robotyne. A Ukrainian brigade throws heavy equipment into battle, attempting to push through Russian defensive lines. Among the armored vehicles, crawling through the soggy black earth, is a behemoth weighing nearly 70 tons. The British main battle tank, Challenger 2. A machine that for 30 years was considered practically invulnerable. Throughout its entire history of operation, not a single Challenger 2 had been destroyed by enemy fire, not in Iraq, nor Bosnia, nor Kosovo, nowhere. There were cases when these tanks took dozens of hits from grenade launchers and anti-tank missiles. They caught fire, lost their tracks, but the crews remained alive, and the machines returned to service. This reputation as a reinforced concrete fortress on tracks seemed unshakable, but on this very September day, everything changed forever. A Russian anti-tank guided missile found its target. The hit proved precise and devastating. The crew managed to leave the vehicle, but the ammunition detonated, and the tank was completely destroyed. For the first time in the entire history of the Challenger 2 model's existence, one was lost to direct enemy fire. The news spread across world military forums and analytical publications in mere hours. Journalist David Axe wrote a detailed breakdown of this incident for Forbes, and the material instantly gained hundreds of thousands of views. For the British military community, this was a blow not so much to the tactical situation as to national pride. After this incident, the remaining 14 Challenger 2s in Ukraine were moved to the role of stationary firing positions, effectively turning them into a kind of artillery that pounded Russian trenches with high explosive fragmentation shells from a distance of about 3 kilometers. But the problem lay far beyond just this specific defeat. The war in Ukraine exposed a whole bouquet of weaknesses that specialists had noticed long ago. The old rifled gun of the Challenger 2 required separate loading. The charge and the projectile were stored separately and had to be joined before firing. This process took precious seconds. The rifled barrel wore out catastrophically fast, withstanding approximately 500 shots instead of the 1,500 that modern smoothbore guns are capable of processing. The ammunition was not compatible with the NATO standard, meaning that in a coalition battle, the Challenger could not receive shells from allies. The electronics, developed in the 90s, were morally obsolete, and the 1,200 horsepower engine struggled to pull the 70-ton machine through Ukrainian mud, causing the tank to regularly get stuck and require engineering vehicles for evacuation. And this is where the most interesting part begins. The fact is, the British were perfectly aware of all these problems long before the events in Ukraine. They knew and did nothing for 2 decades. The history of creating the new Challenger 3 tank is not a story of an engineering breakthrough. It is a story of bureaucratic madness, budget overruns of hundreds of millions of pounds, endless disputes between the military and politicians, and the striking inability of one of the richest countries in the world to produce an updated tank over the course of 20 years. It all began in 2005, when the British Ministry of Defense released the so-called White Paper on the defense industry. In this document, it was written in black and white that the fleet of Challenger 2 tanks, created in the late 90s, needed a life extension program to ensure the machines remained relevant at least until the mid-2030s. It sounded reasonable and timely, but at that exact moment, the entire British military leadership was consumed by completely different problems. The war in Iraq was ongoing, the operation in Afghanistan was escalating, and all resources, all attention, and all budgets were flowing into counterinsurgency operations. Tanks, against the backdrop of fighting partisans, seemed like a relic of the past. Why modernize heavy armor when the main enemy is a suicide bomber with a martyr's belt in a Baghdad marketplace? The idea of modernization lay as a dead weight for almost 10 years. Only in 2014, when the geopolitical situation in Europe changed abruptly, was the Challenger 2 life extension program finally officially announced. BAE Systems and the German company Rheinmetall presented their prototypes and began competing with each other for the contract. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of bringing the competition to a conclusion, both companies merged their British divisions into a joint venture. The competition ended before it had really begun, and then true chaos ensued. By 2020, the requirements for the new tank were changing again and again. The military leadership could not decide on the gun caliber. One moment they wanted 130 millimeters, then they returned to 120. Some generals insisted on an autoloader, while others were categorically against it. Some Ministry of Defense officials even suggested abandoning their own production and simply purchasing German Leopards. There was no consensus on a single fundamental issue. In 2021, the patience of British parliamentarians finally snapped. The House of Commons Defense Committee, whose duties include overseeing military budget expenditures, published a scathing report on the state of the tank program. The phrasing in this document was remarkably harsh for the staid British Parliament. The committee stated that bureaucratic procrastination, military indecision, financial mismanagement, and general incompetence had led to the project being £220 million over budget and 7 years behind schedule. The word incompetence from a parliamentary committee directed at its own Ministry of Defense is an almost unprecedented level of criticism for British political culture, where even devastating assessments are usually wrapped in polite packaging. And just a week after the publication of this report, whether by incredible coincidence or as a direct reaction to the scandal, Defense Secretary Ben Wallace presented a final plan to Parliament. The government allocated £1,300 million for the conversion of existing Challenger 2 tanks into a new modification under the designation Challenger 3. Formally, this was not about creating a new tank from scratch, but about a deep modernization of machines already in service. But when you look at the volume of planned changes, it becomes clear that only the hull and the chassis will remain from the old tank, and even those not in their entirety. The cost of converting one machine amounted to approximately $7.8 million. For context, this is comparable to the price of the original Challenger 2 itself at the time of its production in the 90s. Essentially, the British paid for each tank twice. There are several reasons for such a high cost. One of the key reasons is the tiny scale of production. When you modernize 150 machines instead of producing thousands, economies of scale simply do not work. Every component becomes more expensive. Each technological line is set up for a small batch run, and every engineering hour is worth its weight in gold. Production was launched at the joint BAE Systems Rheinmetall plant in the town of Telford, Shropshire. The enterprise received £20 million of investment for new equipment and staff retraining. The Ministry of Defense emphasized that the project would create 650 jobs throughout the supply chain within the country. For the British, this was a fundamental point. This was not just about a tank, but about the revival of national competence in armored vehicle production, which had almost been completely lost over 20 years of inaction. The Ministry of Defense explicitly stated that the Challenger 3 program was intended to regenerate the United Kingdom's critical industrial sovereign capability in this field. Now let's look at what this expensive reconstruction was actually for. Let's start with the main thing, the gun, because the replacement of the armament became the most radical and painful decision in the entire history of British tank building. For decades, Great Britain stubbornly clung to rifled tank guns when the rest of the world had long ago switched to smoothbore. This was a kind of national pride. British tankers believed that a rifled barrel provided better accuracy at long distances. There was some truth in this, but only some, because that accuracy came at the cost of a whole set of critical drawbacks. The old 120mm rifled gun of the Challenger 2 used separate loading. The charge and the projectile were stored in different places within the fighting compartment, and the loader had to retrieve one, then the other, join them, and send them into the breech. This slowed the rate of fire and, much more importantly, meant that ammunition was scattered around the fighting compartment near the crew without any isolated protection. If an enemy shell pierced the armor, the detonation of the ammunition could destroy the vehicle along with everyone inside. This is exactly what happened at Robotyne, where the crew barely managed to get out before the explosion. The Challenger 3 is equipped with a fundamentally different gun, the Rheinmetall L55A1 smoothbore gun of 120mm caliber. This is the same gun found on the latest modifications of the German Leopard 2. This gun appeared in 2019 and is capable of withstanding significantly higher chamber pressure than its predecessors. High pressure means the ability to fire a new generation of ammunition that the old Challenger simply could not handle. The first of these is the DM-73 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot round. According to British armor expert Nicholas Drummond, this long tungsten rod is capable of penetrating 800 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. This means the projectile will punch through the side of practically any existing tank. The second revolutionary round is the DM-11 programmable multi-purpose shell. This is a true miracle of engineering. Before the shot, an electronic module programs the fuse, and the gunner can choose one of 3 detonation modes. The shell will explode over the target, in front of it, or after it has pierced a wall and is inside a room. The same shell can work against infantry in trenches, light armor, and fortified positions in buildings. And the transition to the NATO standard of unitary loading solved another problem we already discussed. Now the ammunition is stored in a separate, isolated compartment with an armored door that protects the crew in case of detonation. If the shells detonate, the explosive energy will escape through special blowout panels outward rather than into the fighting compartment. This is how Abramses and Leopards are designed, and it is precisely why the crews of those machines survive even during catastrophic hits. If the gun is the tank's fist, then the electronics are its brain and eyes. And this is where the gap between the old Challenger 2 and the new Challenger 3 is felt most acutely. The previous machine carried 90s-era electronics built on a so-called point architecture, where each instrument existed by itself and communicated with the others through unique, incompatible protocols. This system had nothing in common with other British combat vehicles, let alone with NATO ally equipment. The tank was a digital hermit on the battlefield, unable to exchange data with anyone. On the Challenger 3, all of this was thrown out and replaced with a single digital platform called the Generic Vehicle Architecture. The name sounds boring, but the essence behind it is revolutionary. It is an open network system that combines all sensors, sights, the ballistic computer, communication tools, and navigation into a single information space. The tank can now exchange data in real time with other British armored vehicles, infantry units, aviation, and even NATO ally equipment. Great Britain is investing £15 billion over the next decade to create a so-called digital backbone for all its armed forces, and the Challenger 3 will be one of the first elements of this giant mosaic. But let's move from abstract architecture to the specific things these electronics can do. Let's start with the eyes. On the old Challenger 2, only the gunner had a thermal imager, while the commander made do with regular optics. On the new machine, both the commander and the gunner received the latest generation Orion thermal imaging sights with a resolution that is incomparable to their predecessors. The commander's sight is installed independently of the turret at the highest point and can rotate 360 degrees. This allows for the implementation of the tactic that tankers call hunter-killer. The commander searches for the next target while the gunner is still destroying the previous one. The speed of target processing with this approach increases manifold. Now to the system that can save the crew's life before the first shot is even fired. The Challenger 3 is equipped with a laser warning system under the acronym LWS. It works as follows. The vast majority of modern anti-tank missiles, such as the Russian Kornet, are guided by a laser beam. Helicopters, infantry squads, other tanks, they all first paint the target with a laser to guide the munition to it. LWS instantly detects this illumination and uses complex mathematical calculations to determine the exact location of the source. The system is capable of automatically slewing the turret directly toward the threat, giving the crew the opportunity to fire first or at least deploy a smoke screen and evade the strike. Something similar has existed for a long time. On Russian T-90 tanks since the late 80s, the Shtora electro-optical system has been installed, those famous glowing eyes on the sides of the turret. However, the British system is significantly more advanced because the data from the laser sensor passes through onboard artificial intelligence. This software suite collects information from all the tank's passive sensors, analyzes images from the commander's and gunner's sights, and provides the crew with a prioritized target list. The machine itself determines who should be destroyed first. A stationary tank at 300 meters that is about to fire is more dangerous than a distant moving target that has not noticed you yet. Moreover, the system is capable of detecting threats that the human eye would miss. Infantry with thermal camouflage or a disguised remote-controlled firing point sticking out of a ditch. And finally, something no conversation about British armor is complete without: the kettle. This is not a joke. Inside every British combat transport vehicle, a standard boiler is installed, officially called the vessel boiling electric. British service members call it the most important piece of equipment in the vehicle, and that is only half ironic. On the Challenger 3, this legendary device is now connected to that same unified digital architecture mentioned above. The commander can brew tea while his tank exchanges data with NATO weapons systems. The British remain true to themselves under any circumstances. The war in Ukraine taught the world's armies one cruel lesson that no one expected. The main enemy of tanks turned out not to be other tanks, as had been assumed for decades, but cheap drones with heat munitions attached to them and man-portable anti-tank missile systems in the hands of infantry. A kamikaze drone costing a few $100s is capable of disabling a machine worth several million. Russian tankers at the front began welding metal structures onto their machines, popularly nicknamed braziers and visors, trying to somehow protect themselves from attacks from above. It looked crude, but it reflected a real and deadly problem faced by all sides of the conflict. British engineers, observing what was happening, chose a fundamentally different approach to this task. On the Challenger 3, it was decided to install the Israeli Trophy Active Protection System, developed by the company Rafael. The principle of its operation is radically different from passive grills and applique screens. Radar modules of the system continuously scan the space around the tank, and upon detecting an incoming rocket or guided munition, they release a stream of kinetic pellets toward the threat in fractions of a second, destroying it on the approach. Essentially, the tank shoots down what is flying at it before the moment of impact. This solution added an additional $25.4 million to the total program cost, but significantly increased the machine's survivability in conditions where drones and handheld anti-tank weapons have become the dominant threat. There is, however, one nuance. The trophy system requires the space around the tank to be free of large external elements because the interceptors must have a clear line of fire. This means that hanging slat armor and cages around the turret and hull in the style of the Ukrainian front is problematic. They could block the system's operation. However, new low-profile variants of additional protection have already appeared that could theoretically be combined with active defense. Now let's talk about passive protection, the armor itself. The Challenger 2 was famous for its Chobham armor, also known as Dorchester. This was second-generation composite armor developed by a British military laboratory in the 70s and 80s and considered the best in the world at the time. It was thanks to this armor that tanks withstood dozens of hits in Iraq and returned to base under their own power. But decades have passed. Anti-tank munitions have become significantly more powerful, and even the legendary Dorchester no longer provided the former level of protection. For the Challenger 3, the British Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, together with BAE Systems and Rheinmetall, developed a fundamentally new modular armor protection consisting of two components. The outer layer received the designation EPSM, and the inner layer, Farnham. The exact composition of both components is classified, but the key word here is modularity. Armor plates are attached to the hull and turret in separate blocks, allowing a damaged segment to be quickly replaced in field conditions without sending the whole tank to the factory. The sides and frontal projection have become noticeably thicker compared to the predecessor, and the turret itself was completely redesigned to accommodate the new weapons and protection systems. Major changes also occurred under the hull. The Challenger 3 received third-generation hydrop pneumatic suspension. The British are the only ones in NATO who stubbornly use this type of suspension, while all other tanks in the world, since the days of World War II, have used torsion bars. The hydrop pneumatic system is significantly more complex to maintain and more expensive to produce, but it gives the tank exceptional ride smoothness and gun stability when firing on the move. For the British tank school, which historically places fire accuracy above all other characteristics, this is a fundamental point. The crew gains the ability to conduct aimed fire at speed and over rough terrain with a level of stabilization that is simply unavailable to torsion bar suspensions. However, the situation with the engine is ambiguous. In the expert community, there are still debates about exactly which motor is under the hood of the Challenger 3. Some analysts believe it is the same Perkins diesel with twin turbochargers producing 1,200 horsepower as on the predecessor. Others claim the machine received a modernized engine with the Index CV129A with an improved cooling system and reduced thermal signature. But regardless of which version turns out to be correct, the problem remains. The Challenger 3, by various estimates, weighs from 72 to 75 tons. 1,200 horsepower for such a mass is approximately 16 horsepower per ton, making it one of the least power-to-weight ratioed main battle tanks in the world. Expert Nicholas Drummond pointed directly to this problem and suggested installing the MT-883 Euro Power Pack power unit with 1,650 horsepower, which would radically change the tank's mobility. But the British Ministry of Defence insists that the maximum speed of the Challenger 3 will be 59 kilometers per hour on paved surfaces and will remain at the level of its predecessor. For comparison, the American Abrams and the Israeli Merkava accelerate to 72 kilometers per hour, and the German Leopard 2 to 68. The transmission remains almost unchanged, 6 forward and 2 reverse gears. Reverse speed of up to 40 kilometers per hour remains an important tactical advantage for the NATO doctrine, where a tank rolls out from behind cover, fires, and quickly reverses back. Out of the 221 Challenger 2 tanks in service with the British Army, only 148 machines will undergo modernization to the Challenger 3 level. The remaining 73 will be retired and stripped for spare parts or sent for disposal. 148 tanks for the entire United Kingdom, a country with a population of 68 million people and the 6th largest military budget on the planet, which amounts to $74.9 billion a year. For comparison, Poland, with a population of 41 million people, plans to bring its tank fleet to 1,300 machines. The difference is nearly ninefold, and it is not accidental. The fact is that Great Britain consciously chose a completely different role for itself within the North Atlantic Alliance. The NATO strategic concept assumes that each participant contributes to the common defense what they are best suited for. The British government, at the highest level in a document titled The Integrated Operating Concept, and in the 2020 Integrated Review, defined its priorities very clearly: space, cyber warfare, unmanned systems, and nuclear deterrence. Land forces were far from the top of this list. The British placed their bet on the fleet and aviation, which is logical for an island nation for whom a land invasion is the least likely threat. And if tanks are suddenly needed in large numbers, the Americans alone have over 8,000 machines in storage that can be pulled from mothballs and handed over to allies. Essentially, London entrusted heavy land warfare to its partners in the alliance. It is a kind of game of trust with very high stakes. 148 Challenger 3s will allow for the formation of 2 heavy brigade combat groups. It's not much, but each of these brigades will be equipped with technology capable of operating in a unified digital network with any NATO ally. The largest grouping of British tanks is currently stationed in Estonia. 30 machines as part of the alliance's enhanced forward presence, side by side with Danish armor. It was for such deployments that the Challenger 3 was intended. Small but extremely well-equipped units scattered across Europe's hotspots to deter a potential adversary. The first 8 prototypes have already rolled off the production line at the Telford plant and headed for combat trials. One demonstration that made a strong impression on observers was firing in a completely remote mode without a single person inside the machine. The tank independently aimed at the target and fired, controlled by an operator at a safe distance. True, the practical value of this trick is still questionable because without an autoloader, someone still has to manually send a shell into the breech for the next shot. Rather, it was a demonstration of the digital architecture's capabilities than a ready combat function. But the very fact that a tank weighing nearly 75 tons is capable of firing without a crew speaks to the platform's potential for future modifications. The remaining 140 machines will arrive at the plant in batches. Old Challenger 2s are driven onto the production line, disassembled, fitted with a new turret, electronics, armament, and armor, and the output is effectively a different tank. This process will stretch until 2027, and the full integration of all machines into combat formations will not be completed before 2030. The planned service life of the Challenger 3 is at least until 2040. This means that a platform whose lineage dates back to machines of the late 90s will have to remain competitive for almost half a century from the moment of the original's creation. And while 8 prototypes thunder with shots at the ranges of Shropshire, the British Army continues to shrink. Its strength has been cut to 75,000 people, the lowest level since the Napoleonic Wars. Will these 150 tanks have time to reach the frontline units before the world throws another surprise at London? A question to which no one has an answer right now. If you like this story, give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. And in the comments, write whether you think 150 tanks will be enough for Britain, or if this bet on high technology instead of quantity will one day play against them.